the English are actually Scythian Hyperborean nobility, we are told a simple story, that the English were born from two peoples, the Anglo-Saxons, who arrived from across the sea after Rome withdrew, and the native Britons, the so-called Celts. According to the textbooks, this mixing of tribes and tongues, of Saxon settlers and British natives, slowly gave rise to what we now call Englishness. But this explanation, for all its perfection, doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't explain the deeper symbols, the sacred bonds, the twin founders, the sword in the earth, the dragon curled around a hoard, the fire in the sky and the king in the sun. It doesn't explain why the earliest myths of England came not just from Saxony or Wales, but from somewhere older, from the endless grasslands beyond the Black Sea, from the windswept silence of the steppes, from Scythia, from Hyperborea. The oldest songs of the English are like dreams remembered from another life, full of horse warriors, sun symbols, and rites that come not from the forests of Germania nor the hills of Britain, but from the vast steppes beyond the dawn. Stephen Pollington, historian and Old English scholar. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius deployed around 8,000 Sarmatian cavalry to Britain. Marcus compelled the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐠 to furnish him with 8,000 cavalry, of whom 5,000 he sent to Britain. Cassius Dio, Roman History, Book 72, 229 AD. The 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐠 were a major Sarmatian people who lived in the Pannonian Plain, which is a modern Hungary and Serbia area. They were soldiers and also representatives of a Scythian-descended Indo-European warrior tradition, one that originated on the Pontic steppe, but not your average sandals and shield brigade. These were sun-worshipping, horse-riding, sword-obsessed elites. Naturally, the Romans looked at them and thought, excellent, let's post them to Lancashire and Yorkshire. So they did. The Sarmatians settled, married local women, and quietly passed on their peculiar taste for dragon standards and sacred weaponry. This wasn't some quaint Saxon Celtic tea party, it was a Roman relocation scheme with side effects. And when English myths start sounding suspiciously like steppe war poetry, you have to ask, is it heritage or just a spectacular case of cultural identity theft? The heroic code in Beowulf, blood loyalty, warrior kings, dragon slaying, and the centrality of the sword matches Sarmatian war ideology. The twin founders, Hengist and Horsa, don't just appear out of thin air. They follow a pattern found across Indo-European myth, the divine twins. This same ideology appears in Vedic India, the Asvins, in Greek mythology, Castor and Pollux, and in the founding of Rome itself with Romulus and Remus. Twin brothers, one dies, one survives, one becomes king. In every case, the twins represent more than just brothers. They symbolize duality, founding violence, divine ancestry, and the birth of a people. Hengist and Horsa aren't just names in a chronicle, they're part of an Indo-European structure that predates England and even Rome. The figure of the sacred sword in Arthurian legend is consistent with Scythian religious practice, where the sword was not just a weapon, but a divine symbol often driven into the earth and worshipped. None of this originates in Anglo-Saxon paganism alone. These ideas appear earlier and across a wider Indo-European tradition that includes the Scythians. This is not a fringe idea. Respected scholars like C. Scott Littleton and Anne C. Thomas have documented Sarmatian influence on Arthurian legends. The core of the Arthurian and Holy Grail traditions derive not from Celtic mythology, but rather from the folklore of the peoples of ancient Scythia. C. Scott Littleton and Linda A. Malka, From Scythia to Camelot, 1994. Archaeological evidence supports the presence of Sarmatian cavalry in Roman Britain. The fort at Ribchester, Bremetenicum, in Lancashire, was garrisoned by Sarmatian units, as confirmed by inscriptions and military records. A tombstone found in Chester depicts a cavalryman with a dragon standard, a known Sarmatian symbol. And in 2017, a Roman-era skeleton unearthed near Offord Cluny, Cambridgeshire, showed genetic ancestry from the Caucasus, consistent with Sarmatian origins. The English identity did not come from nowhere. and it wasn't formed purely by the Germanic migration. There is a credible case that elite Indo-European warrior traditions brought to Britain through the Roman military system contributed to the foundation of what would become the English people, culturally and genetically. This doesn't mean the English are Scythians in the pure sense, but it does mean that Scythian nobility and symbolism likely played a role in the early development of English identity in a way that has been ignored, dismissed, or buried. So, is it true? From a materialist perspective, unlikely. From a mytho-symbolic traditionalist perspective, absolutely yes. The real ancient British language was Hebrew. According to this theory, the original language of ancient Britain wasn't Celtic, Latin, or even Proto-Indo-European. Nope, it was Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew to be exact. This idea first gained traction in the 18th and 19th centuries with the rise of British Israelism, the belief that the British are quite literally the lost tribes of Israel. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. It wasn't just some drunken theory cooked up in a Carmarthen pub either. Respectable clergymen like Reverend 𝐬𝐿𝐸𝐵𝐿 Williams insisted that most ancient Welsh words could be traced back to Hebrew roots. Because obviously when you hear
Any more passengers for 𝐿𝐵𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿
Johnson, author of our Israelitish origin, went even further, claiming the 10 lost tribes packed their bags, left the Middle East, and somehow ended up in Middlesex. In his words, the Anglo-Saxons are of the posterity of Ephraim, the youngest son of Joseph, which means, according to him, Britain didn't just inherit the Bible, it starred in it. Even General Charles Vallancey, an Irish antiquarian, threw his weight behind it, insisting that Celtic languages, including Welsh, had deep Semitic roots. Proponents of the theory pointed to convenient little coincidences in vocabulary, like how the Welsh word for God, do, vaguely sounds like the Hebrew El or Yah. Never mind that Hebrew is Semitic and Welsh is Indo-European. Minor detail. Because the argument was never really about etymology. It was about destiny, a national myth dressed in biblical robes, with just enough linguistic wizardry to convince people that Mount Sinai was, perhaps, just outside Swansea. One of the most cited works is from Reverend Eliezer Williams, who insisted that the Welsh language contained more Hebrew roots than any other tongue. A bold claim, though not one accepted by actual linguists. Supporters of the theory also loved the triads of Britain and the Welsh Chronicles, suggesting that early British texts hide encoded Hebrew meanings, and that ancient Druidic wisdom was just a repackaged form of Old Testament knowledge. Critics argue this is pure linguistic pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist. Welsh is a Brythonic Celtic language, well documented and Indo-European in structure. It doesn't share grammatical rules or connected systems with Semitic languages like Hebrew. Still, this theory refuses to die. Why? Because it's not really about grammar, it's about identity. About linking Britain directly to biblical history, about claiming a divine origin story. So is it true, linguistically? No. But symbolically, it fits right into a long tradition of rewriting national myths to sound just a little more chosen. The Bible was actually written in Glastonbury. Joseph of Arimathea was supposedly just a rich guy with a tomb, but according to British legend, he was also Jesus' uncle, and a merchant who sailed the tin routes between Judea and Britain. The earliest written trace of this claim appears in the 12th century poem Joseph d'Arimathie by Robert de Boron, where Joseph collects Christ's blood in the Holy Grail. Later, the chronicler of John of Glastonbury, 14th century, builds on the myth, claiming Joseph brought the Grail to Glastonbury and was buried there with it. The story goes like this: Joseph didn't just trade with the Druids, he brought Jesus with him. As a boy? For a little holiday in the hills of Avalon. And if that sounds mad, well, so does half of the Old Testament. This was no casual visit either. Local legend says Jesus studied with the Druids, maths, astronomy, maybe even a bit of proto-quantum physics. Scholars like Dr. Gordon Strachan even suggested he came here to learn from their wisdom. You know, just your typical summer break for the Son of God. And then, after the crucifixion, Joseph came back. This time, not just with trade goods, but with the Holy Grail. Yes, that one. The chalice from the Last Supper, with a couple of vials of Christ's blood for good measure. He planted his staff in the ground at Glastonbury and it turned into a blooming thorn tree, a Middle Eastern species that flowers at Christmas on a hill in Somerset. Of course, this is usually dismissed as myth, but by the medieval period, Glastonbury was considered the oldest Christian site in Britain. The monks even claimed their abbey was built by Jesus himself, or Joseph, or St. Patrick, depending on which century you asked. Glastonbury wasn't just some quiet little chapel either, it was a pilgrimage centre. Arthurian legend says King Arthur and Guinevere are buried there, the Holy Grail supposedly hidden somewhere in the grounds. In 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have discovered the burial site of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur, with Guinevere, his second wife, in the Isle of Avalon, Gerald of Wales, De Principis Instructione AD 1193. And it was a powerhouse of manuscript production including Bibles, or at least copies of them. Pages of what scholars now call the Glastonbury Bible survive, dating to around 1250, ornate and richly decorated. So no, Glastonbury didn't literally write the Bible, but it wrote a lot of it. It rewrote the story of Christ for an English audience. It wove Christian myth with native legend. It made Britain the backdrop of the sacred. And isn't that the point? And let's talk about that thorn tree. The Glastonbury thorn, supposedly sprouted from Joseph's staff, isn't just some poetic footnote. It's real. Botanists have confirmed it's a variant of Crataegus monogyna, a species not native to Britain but common in the Middle East. One of these trees blooms twice a year, once in spring and suspiciously right around Christmas. Coincidence or divine gardening? By the 14th century, pilgrims were swarming Glastonbury, because this wasn't just another relic hustling abbey, this was the British Jerusalem, the place where the Grail had touched down, where the first Christian church supposedly stood, long before Rome ever set foot on these shores. Even Edward I and Edward III got in on the act, sending royal envoys to venerate the place. And when Henry VIII came smashing up the monasteries in the 1530s, Glastonbury's abbot was dragged to the top of Glastonbury Tor and executed. Not just for resisting reform, but because the abbey was simply too powerful, too legendary, too English. The myth had become dangerous, and still bits of it survived. So maybe Glastonbury didn't invent the Bible, but it did something more audacious. It claimed it. It took the story of Jesus, the man from Nazareth, and said he walked here. In the mud, in the fog, among the hills, and for centuries, people believed it. So is it true? Did Jesus really come to Glastonbury? Did Joseph of Arimathea bring the Holy Grail to Somerset? Did a thorn tree from the Holy Land bloom in English soil? Historically, probably not. But symbolically, culturally, spiritually, Glastonbury became England's sacred origin point because people needed it to be. Because a people without sacred stories are easier to forget. And this story rooted Christianity in English soil centuries before Rome claimed the patent. The British Isles were Atlantis. Allegedly, probably, maybe. Forget Santorini. According to some, the real Atlantis wasn't lost in the Mediterranean. It's currently pretending to be Britain. Authors like Jean de Ruel and Vyacheslav Kudryavtsev have argued that either Doggerland, the now submerged land between Britain and Europe, or the Celtic shelf near the Scilly Isles fits Plato's description far better than anywhere in Greece. The theory goes like this. Long before the Celts were carving spirals or the Romans were building bathhouses, the British Isles, or more accurately, the lands around them, were the heart of an ancient, highly advanced civilization. Welcome to Atlantis, rich in metals, good with boats, and possibly armed with prehistoric broadband, judging by how clever they were meant to be. The big clue: tin. Plato said Atlantis was an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, modern-day Gibraltar, and rich in metals including the fabled orichalcum. Now, ancient Britain, particularly Cornwall and Devon, was one of the world's primary sources of tin. And you can't have a Bronze Age without tin. So, either Britain was Atlantis, or Atlantis was outsourcing to us. Either way, we were essential. Then there's Doggerland, the now submerged land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was vast, fertile, populated, and went under in a series of mega floods, possibly sparked by the 𝐟𝐸𝐫𝐬𝐫𝐸𝐿 tsunami around 6200 BC. Sound familiar? That's right, cataclysm, flood, vanishing civilization. It's basically Plato's script, just with more fog. The Atlantic Ocean itself? Some say it's named after Atlantis, not a coincidence, just the world's biggest breadcrumb lying wet and ignored. Oh, and let's not forget, Stonehenge. According to some theories, its builders may have come from these now lost lands, dragging their architectural talents with them before they drowned. Makes sense, if you're fleeing Atlantis, you might as well build a calendar on the way out. And of course, no British myth buffet would be complete without Glastonbury. If Britain was Atlantis, then Glastonbury was Eden, or Jerusalem, or the middle of a ley line Venn diagram where Jesus once took a gap year with the Druids. Pick your legend. Is there definitive proof? Not unless you count dodgy maps, ancient tin mines, and lots of wishful thinking. But still, when half of Britain acts like it's the centre of the universe, maybe it's not just ego, maybe it's collective ancestral memory from our days as Atlantean overlords. Was Atlantis just beneath our wellies the whole time? There's no hard proof, but enough myth, metal, and missing land to keep the question alive. The Queen was a lizard, but you knew that already. Sorry, but you gotta drop at least one David Icke classic in there. Right, so here's how it goes. Queen Elizabeth II wasn't just the longest reigning monarch in British history. She was, according to some corners of the internet, a shape-shifting reptilian from the Draco star system who ruled over the human cattle while sipping blood and taking orders from a 12-foot-tall interdimensional overlord named Zarg. Makes sense, right? Enter David Icke, the former BBC sports presenter turned full-time prophet of galactic madness. Now let's be fair, David actually says a lot of things that do make sense. He's talked about central banking cartels, media manipulation, global surveillance, and elite paedophile networks years before Epstein made it dinner table conversation. On that, he wasn't crazy, he was ahead of the curve. But then he went full David. Because just when you're nodding along thinking, okay, maybe this guy's onto something, he tells you the Queen unzips her skin at Balmoral and transforms into a 7-foot iguana with a crown. That's not just a left turn, that's flying off the motorway into the 4th dimension. And that's when you have to ask, is he serious? Or is he sabotaging his own message on purpose? Because if you wanted to take genuine, legitimate concerns about global corruption, child trafficking, technocratic control, and make sure no one ever takes them seriously again, what would you do? You'd start with facts, then sprinkle in a bit of lizard. You'd become David. So where does this all come from? Ancient Mesopotamia, Sumerian tablets, a dodgy ayahuasca trip? According to David, it all started with the Anunnaki, extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth thousands of years ago to mine gold, enslave humanity, and apparently launch the British aristocracy. Somewhere between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Crown, they morphed into the Babylonian Brotherhood, a global bloodline of shape-shifting reptilians who now occupy high political office, run multinational banks, and yes, sit on the throne at Buckingham Palace. Of course, the evidence for this is, well, let's call it interpretive. A weird sculpture here, a snake on a royal coat of arms there. And then there's the pièce de résistance, grainy YouTube videos where a politician's eyes glitch, supposedly revealing their scaly inner self. That's right, forget gene sequencing or journalism. This is all based on the 240p footage of a BBC News anchor blinking. But David didn't stop at glitchy eyes and coat of arms snakes. No, he built an entire cosmology. According to him, the Anunnaki, those ancient space overlords, didn't just enslave humanity to mine gold. They created a bloodline, a hybrid ruling class, reptilian DNA stitched into human skin. These hybrids, David claims, became the pharaohs, the Roman emperors, the aristocracy of Europe, and eventually the CEOs, bankers, and political elites of today. The Windsors, of course, right at the top. And it's not just the Queen. According to David, George W. Bush, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and almost every major royal house in Europe are part of this scaly fraternity. Even Bob Hope gets a mention because nothing screams galactic shapeshifter quite like a wartime entertainer. Now, how does he know all this? Channeled knowledge, ancient texts, secret insiders? They control everything, feed off negative energy, and manipulate society through fear, wars, pandemics, economic crashes, all part of the great energy harvesting operation. And where do they operate from? The lower fourth dimension, obviously, which sounds suspiciously like the kind of thing you say after licking a toad in a Wiltshire forest.
Thank you for providing us this medicine,
healing us and teaching us how to kill ourselves.
But again, here's the trick. You take real questions, real patterns, real abuses of power, and then you wrap them in a 12-foot space dragon suit, because once you start talking about giant lizards wearing human skin, everything else, Bilderberg, Epstein, central banks, media corruption, gets dragged down with it. It's not that people don't care, it's that the second you mention the Queen is a lizard, the whole conversation is dead in the water, because the messenger made them radioactive. That's strategy. So is it true? No, the Queen wasn't a lizard. But if you were trying to protect the real monsters in power, you couldn't have picked a better distraction.